Cayla Thompson's own aunt told her, one afternoon over tea, that it would be best if she no longer attended social gatherings. It was not said unkindly. On the contrary, the concern was framed as consideration for Cayla, and for the gentleman who found her scars unsettling. The family did what it could to soften the suggestion. A cousin offered gloves long enough to conceal her arm. Her former governess spoke gently of inner virtues. Even the family physician, after careful thought, advised that Cayla might consider herself retired from courtship, despite being only 23. Cayla listened, and then she chose otherwise. She continued to accept invitations, continued to submit to introductions, continued to observe the precise moment when a man's attention shifted, when politeness tightened and interest quietly withdrew upon noticing the burn scars that traced her arm. 3 years after the fire that claimed her parents and altered the course of her life, she found herself seated opposite George Christie, Duke of Ravensmere. He appeared civil, distant, and already halfway gone. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady from long practice, "before you give more of your time than necessary, there is something you should see." She raised her sleeve. He did not turn away. Instead, he studied her in silence, his expression unreadable, before speaking at last. "I need you to understand," he said slowly, "what this costs us both."
George Christie had perfected the art of the polite exit. 20 minutes of strained conversation, 1 cup of tepid tea, a manufactured excuse about estate business requiring his immediate attention, he could be out the door before the disappointment fully registered on anyone's face. He employed this strategy religiously because the alternative, staying long enough for women to discover he was neither charming nor particularly interested in the performative rituals of courtship, felt infinitely worse than being thought rude. The Thompson residence appeared unremarkable as his carriage pulled to a stop, a modest townhouse in a respectable neighborhood, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the encroaching dusk. His godmother had insisted this introduction was different, that Miss Thompson was not like the others, employing the same reassurances she'd used for the previous 6 arranged meetings. George had stopped believing her after the 3rd. The housekeeper led him to a drawing room decorated with careful austerity, good furniture maintained beyond its fashionable years, silver tea service polished to brightness, fresh flowers arranged with more enthusiasm than skill. A fire burned in the grate, making the small space almost uncomfortably warm. Cayla Thompson stood when he entered, and George's first thought was that she looked cornered. Not nervous in the fluttering, hopeful way of most young women facing a potential suitor, but braced, defensive. Her brown hair was pinned simply, her dress a muted gray that seemed designed to avoid notice rather than attract it. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that felt more obligatory than deferential. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Thompson?" George bowed, already calculating his escape route. "The pleasure is mine." They sat. The housekeeper poured tea with trembling hands. She seemed more anxious about this meeting than either of the actual participants, and retreated, leaving them in the oppressive silence of 2 people who had nothing to say to each other. George reached for his teacup. 15 minutes, he decided. He could endure 15 minutes. "Your Grace," Cayla said abruptly, setting her own cup down, untouched, "before you waste another moment of your evening, there's something you should see." Her fingers moved to the buttons at her collar, then to her sleeve, and George froze with his teacup halfway to his lips. For one bewildering moment, he thought she was about to do something wildly inappropriate, but her expression held no seduction, only grim determination. She pulled the fabric up past her elbow, then higher, exposing her shoulder. The scars were worse than he'd imagined scars could be. Thick, twisted ropes of pink and white tissue consumed her skin from wrist to collarbone. The flesh puckered and discolored in patterns that suggested unimaginable pain. In some places, the scars formed ridges. In others, the skin looked almost melted. "A fire," she said, her voice flat. 6 years ago. My parents didn't survive it." She met his eyes directly, challenging him to look away. "Every gentleman who has seen this has found a reason to leave within the week. Most leave immediately." She paused, her jaw tight. So you might as well go now, Your Grace. Save us both the pretense of interest." George set his teacup down carefully. His hands weren't quite steady. "No," he said. Cayla blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "No." He leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze. "I'm not leaving." "You don't understand what you're—" "I understand that you're testing me," George interrupted, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "You're showing me the worst thing that's ever happened to you and waiting for me to do what every other man has done." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or the beginning of confusion. "And?" she asked, her scarred arm still exposed between them. "What makes you different from every other man?" George opened his mouth, then closed it. The honest answer lodged in his throat, too raw and too revealing for a first meeting. He looked at her, really looked at the defensive set of her shoulders, the challenge in her eyes, the way she held herself as though braced for a blow. He recognized all of it. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I'd like the chance to find out." Cayla's breath caught. Her hand moved as if to lower her sleeve, then stopped. "You're serious? Entirely? You're not repulsed?" "I'm not leaving," George repeated, and realized with some surprise that he meant it, not as a polite gesture or a charitable impulse, but as something closer to curiosity. This woman had stripped herself bare in the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance, not literally, but in every way that mattered. She had handed him a weapon and dared him to use it, and he found he didn't want to. "You'll change your mind," Cayla said, but her voice had lost some of her certainty. "They always do." "Perhaps," George met her eyes, "or perhaps you'll decide you don't want me to stay, but I'm asking for the opportunity to prove you wrong, Miss Thompson, if you'll allow it." The silence stretched between them, fragile and alive with possibility. Cayla's scarred arm remained exposed, close enough that George could have reached across the small distance and touched it. He didn't, not yet. The gesture felt too significant, too loaded with meaning neither of them was ready to name. Instead, he waited. Finally, Cayla lowered her sleeve with slow, deliberate movements, covering the scars but not hiding from his gaze. "One more visit," Cayla said quietly. "That's all I'm offering." "One more visit," George agreed. Neither of them touched their tea, neither of them looked away, and when George finally left the Thompson residence 20 minutes later, his manufactured excuse unused, his usual exit strategy abandoned, he realized he had no idea what he'd just agreed to. Only that, for the first time in years, he wanted to find out.
And if you're still watching without subscribing, you're literally choosing to miss out on content made exactly for people like you. Don't be that person. Subscribe now before you forget and regret it later. George returned to the Thompson residence 3 days later, and this time there was no housekeeper hovering nervously by the door. Cayla answered it herself, her expression guarded but no longer openly hostile. She wore a different dress, still gray, still modest, but her hair was arranged with slightly more care. "Your Grace," she said, stepping aside, "I wasn't certain you'd actually come." "I gave my word." George removed his hat, handing it to her, since no servant appeared to claim it. "Though I confess am unclear on the terms of this visit. Am I to be tested again, or have I passed some preliminary examination?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. "I haven't decided yet." They settled in the same drawing room, but the atmosphere felt different, less like a battlefield, more like a negotiation where neither party knew what they were bargaining for. The tea service sat ready on the table between them, and this time Cayla poured with steady hands. "You asked me to stay long enough to hear about your scars," she said without preamble, "but you never actually told me what they were." George accepted the teacup she offered. "I thought perhaps we might begin with yours. You showed me the evidence, but not the story." "The story is exactly what you'd expect." Cayla's voice was matter-of-fact, but her fingers tightened around her cup. "A fire, a house burning, parents who didn't get out in time. That's the summary," George said quietly, "not the story." Cayla looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he deserved the truth. Then she set her cup down and began. "I was 17. We'd been at a dinner party that evening. My parents, myself, my younger brother, Thomas. We came home late, and I went straight to bed with a headache."
Her voice remained steady, but something brittle entered it. I woke to smoke. The hallway was already engulfed. My father pushed me toward the window, told me to climb down the trellis. I refused. I wanted to help, to go back for Thomas. My father grabbed my arm. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her sleeve. He was holding a lamp. The oil spilled. My sleeve caught fire. George's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He put it out with his bare hands, burned himself doing it. Then he shoved me toward the window and went back inside. I climbed down and stood in the garden, watching the house burn. They carried out 3 bodies an hour later. She looked directly at George. Thomas escaped through the kitchen. I was the only one my father stopped to save. If he hadn't wasted those 30 seconds on my sleeve, he might have reached my mother. "You don't know that," George said. "I know he chose me." The words came out sharp, edged with 6 years of guilt. And I've spent every day since wondering if it was worth it. The silence felt heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. "After the fire, everything changed," Cayla continued, her voice quieter now. "Not immediately. People were kind at first, sympathetic, but sympathy spoils quickly. Within months, I became something people avoided. Conversations died when I approached. Mothers steered their sons away. I received 3 proposals, a widower needing a nursemaid, a cousin wanting my property, and a merchant who thought a scarred gentlewoman better than none at all." She smiled without humor. "I declined them all. I may be marked, Your Grace, but I'm not desperate enough to be someone's compromise." George set his cup down, feeling the weight of her isolation like a physical thing between them. He understood it, not the specifics, but the shape of it, the slow erosion of belonging. "You're not damaged," he said finally. "I'm scarred, yes, but those aren't the same thing." Cayla looked at him as though trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. "Why are you here, Your Grace? Really, what could you possibly want from a woman like me?" "Honestly," George met her gaze, "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know I'd rather be here, listening to you, than anywhere else I'm expected to be." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even particularly romantic, but Cayla's expression softened slightly, and when she poured him a second cup of tea, her hands no longer trembled.
The third visit happened by accident. George had been riding through the park near the Thompson residence when he saw her sitting alone on a bench beneath an oak tree, a book open in her lap, but her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She wore long gloves despite the warmth of the afternoon, and something about her solitary figure made him pull his horse to a stop. "Miss Thompson," he called, dismounting. "Forgive the intrusion." She looked up, startled, then composed herself quickly. "Your Grace, I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you." He approached, leading his horse. "May I?" She gestured to the empty space beside her, and George sat, acutely aware that they had no chaperone, no tea service to occupy their hands, no formal structure to hide behind, just 2 people on a bench in the fading afternoon light. "You've been remarkably patient," Cayla said after a moment, "listening to my tragic history without offering any of your own. One might think you're hiding something." George smiled despite himself. One would be correct. "Well," she closed her book, giving him her full attention, "you promised me your scars, Your Grace. I've shown you mine twice now. It seems only fair." He should have anticipated this, should have prepared something carefully edited, a version of himself that revealed just enough without exposing too much. But sitting beside her in the dappled sunlight, George found he was tired of performing. "My scars aren't visible," he said slowly, "which somehow makes them worse. At least yours offer an explanation for why you feel the way you do." "And how do you feel?" "Inadequate." The word came out before he could stop it. "I've felt inadequate for as long as I can remember. My father was everything a duke should be, commanding, confident, naturally suited to his position. He walked into rooms and people noticed. When he spoke, people listened.
I inherited his title when I was 22, and I've spent the past 11 years trying to wear it like he did. It never quite fits." Cayla's expression shifted slightly, surprise giving way to something more thoughtful. "My peers seem to manage it effortlessly," George continued, the words coming faster now that he'd started. "They navigate society with ease, marry appropriate women, produce heirs, fulfill their duties without apparent strain. I attend the same functions, follow the same protocols, and somehow still feel like an imposter, like everyone can see that I'm performing a role rather than simply being what I'm supposed to be." "So you leave," Cayla said quietly, "before they can confirm what you already believe about yourself." George looked at her sharply. "How did you—" "Because I do the same thing." She pulled off one glove, then the other, exposing the scars in broad daylight. "I show people my worst moment immediately. I tell them to leave before they can decide to stay. It's not honesty, Your Grace. It's control. If I'm the one who ends things, then I haven't actually been rejected." The accuracy of her observation felt like a physical blow. "Every arranged introduction I've attended," George admitted, "I've calculated my exit before the tea is even poured. 20 minutes maximum, manufactured excuse about estate business. Out the door before anyone can look too closely and find me wanting." He met her eyes. "Except with you. You didn't give me the chance to leave first. You forced me to make a choice, stay or go, before I could retreat on my own terms. And you stayed." "I stayed," he agreed, "though I'm still not entirely certain why." "Perhaps because I'm the only person who hasn't expected you to be anything other than what you are," Cayla suggested. "I certainly wasn't hoping for charm or confidence or any of the usual ducal qualities. I was simply waiting for you to leave." "Well, I'm still here." "Yes," she said, studying him with those disconcerting hazel eyes. "You are, and I find myself wondering what that means." George wondered the same thing. This wasn't courtship in any recognizable sense. No flowers, no carefully chaperoned visits, no gradual building of affection through proper channels. This was something raw and more uncertain. Two damaged people sitting on a park bench, acknowledging their wounds without attempting to heal them. "I'd like to continue seeing you," George said finally, "if you're willing. No expectations, no pressure. Just this, whatever this is." Cayla was quiet for a long moment, her scarred hands folded in her lap. "People will talk. They already talk. About me, perhaps, but you're a duke, Your Grace. You could do considerably better than a scarred spinster with no prospects and a tragic past." "Could I?" George asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're the first person in 11 years who's made me feel like perhaps I'm not completely inadequate after all." Her breath caught, and for the first time since he'd met her, Cayla Thompson smiled, not with bitterness or resignation, but with something genuine. "One condition." "Name it." "Stop calling yourself inadequate. You're not. You're just honest about your doubts, which is considerably rarer than confidence." George felt something loosened in his chest. "Agreed. If you stop using your scars as a weapon." "I'll try," Cayla said, "though I make no promises." "Neither do I." They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped lower, and when George finally left, he realized he hadn't once thought about escaping. The pattern established itself without formal agreement. George would arrive at the Thompson residence twice a week, sometimes 3, and they would walk through the small garden behind her house, a modest plot with overgrown roses and a stone path that needed repair. Cayla never dressed for him, never arranged her hair with particular care, and George found this lack of performance strangely liberating. "Your godmother must be beside herself with curiosity," Cayla said during one of these walks, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore short sleeves now when they were alone, the scars visible in the afternoon light.
She's convinced I'm either courting you or conducting some elaborate form of charity work, George replied. I haven't clarified which. And which is it? I honestly don't know. He paused beside a rose bush that had grown wild, its blooms tangled with weeds. Does it matter? I suppose not. Cayla reached out to touch one of the roses, and George noticed how naturally she moved now, no longer hiding her scarred arm or positioning herself to keep it out of sight. Though society will eventually demand clarification. Society can wait. They continued walking, and George found his attention drawn to her arm, not with revulsion or pity, but with simple acknowledgement. The scars were part of her, like the particular way she tilted her head when thinking, or the sardonic edge to her humor. He'd stopped seeing them as damage and started seeing them simply as Cayla. During their next visit, as they sat in her drawing room with tea growing cold between them, George reached across the small table and traced his finger along one of the raised ridges on her forearm. Cayla went perfectly still. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly. "Not anymore. Not physically." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why are you touching it?" "Because you've spent 6 years believing these scars make you untouchable," George said, continuing the gentle movement. "And I am attempting to prove you wrong." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't pull away. "You don't have to." "I know." His thumb moved to another scar, this one crossing her wrist. "I'm not doing this out of obligation, Cayla. I'm doing it because I want you to understand that these don't repel me. They never have." "Everyone else." "I'm not everyone else." George looked up from her arm to meet her eyes. "And you're not the frightened woman who tested me in this room 6 weeks ago. Or perhaps you are, but I'm no longer the man who walked in here planning his escape." Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a tentative hope that looked almost painful in its fragility. Their visits grew longer. Conversations that began over tea would stretch into early evening, neither of them noticing the fading light until Cayla's housekeeper appeared with lamps. They talked about everything and nothing, his difficulties managing his estate, her charity work with wounded soldiers, the books they'd read, the places they'd never traveled. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows and the fire burned low, Cayla rolled up her sleeve completely, without prompting, exposing the full extent of the scarring. George studied it in the firelight, the way the burns had healed in irregular patterns, some areas smooth and others deeply textured. "You're staring," Cayla said, but without her usual defensiveness. "I'm looking," George corrected. "There's a difference." He reached out and placed his palm flat against the scarred skin, his hand warm against her arm. "I'm trying to understand what you survived." "Why?" "Because if I'm going to know you, I need to know all of you, not just the parts you've decided are acceptable." Cayla's hand came up to cover his, pressing it more firmly against her scars. "No one has ever touched me like this, without hesitation, without pretending the scars aren't there." "Then they were fools," George said simply. She laughed, the sound caught between tears and genuine amusement. "You're impossibly stubborn, Your Grace." "George," he corrected, "if I'm going to touch your scars, you might as well use my given name." "George," she repeated, testing the word. Then quieter. "I think I'm starting to believe you might actually mean this." "Good," he said, his hand still warm against her arm. "Because I do." The rain continued outside, but neither of them moved. They sat in the firelight, his hand on her scars, her hand covering his, and for the first time in 6 years, Cayla allowed herself to imagine that perhaps being seen wasn't the same as being rejected after all. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, embossed with the seal of the Veterans Relief Society. Cayla held it for 3 days before showing it to George during one of his visits. "A charitable function," she said, handing him the card, For wounded soldiers and families affected by the recent factory fires. They've asked me to attend because of my nursing work at the Veterans Hospital. George studied the invitation. Will you go? I don't know. Cayla's fingers twisted in her lap. It's one thing to work with patients in a hospital ward where everyone is damaged in some way. It's quite another to stand in a ballroom full of society's finest and be stared at. You wouldn't be alone, George said quietly. I could accompany you if you'd like. She looked at him, searching his face for doubt or obligation. You'd be seen publicly with me? People would draw conclusions. Let them. The evening of the function, Cayla stood in her bedroom staring at two gowns laid across her bed. One had long sleeves and a high collar, her armor, the costume she wore to navigate society. The other had short sleeves that would end just below her elbows, leaving her scars completely exposed. She chose the second dress. George arrived precisely on time, and when she descended the stairs, she watched his expression carefully. His eyes went to her bare arms, traveled the familiar landscape of scarred tissue, then returned to her face. You look beautiful, he said, and meant it. The assembly hall blazed with light, filled with people in evening dress, mingling among displays documenting the work of various charitable organizations. Cayla felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning, eyes finding her exposed arms and staying there. George's hand tightened slightly on her elbow. Steady, he murmured. I'm right here. They moved through the crowd, and Cayla braced herself for the usual response, the sliding away of gazes, the careful distance people maintained from visible damage. But something different happened. A man in military uniform approached, his right sleeve pinned at the shoulder where his arm should have been. He looked directly at Cayla's scars, then at her face, and nodded with unmistakable recognition. Miss Thompson, he said, Lieutenant Harrison, you changed my dressings last month at the Veterans Hospital, told me the scars would fade, but the nightmares might take longer. Cayla blinked, caught off guard. Lieutenant, yes, I remember. How are you healing? Better, thanks to you. He gestured to his empty sleeve. You're one of the only nurses who looked at this and didn't flinch, made me think perhaps I wasn't as monstrous as I felt. Before Cayla could respond, a woman approached with two young children in tow. Miss Thompson, Mrs. Fletcher, you helped my husband after the warehouse fire. He's still recovering, but he wanted me to thank you personally. He said you were the only one who understood what the burns felt like. The physical pain is one thing, another voice added, a young man with scarring across his neck and jaw. But you understood the rest of it, the way people stare, the way they treat you like you're broken. More people approached, a mother whose daughter had survived a kitchen fire, a factory worker still healing from an accident, a veteran who'd pulled Cayla aside at the hospital to ask how she managed to keep living when the scars made her feel so exposed. They didn't pity her, they recognized her. George watched as Cayla transformed before his eyes, the defensive armor she usually wore dissolving as she spoke with these people who understood her particular kind of survival. She rolled her sleeves higher, comparing scars with a veteran. She knelt to speak to a child who'd been burned, showing the little girl that scars could heal. You see, George said quietly when they had a moment alone, you're not damaged. You're simply marked by something you survived. And to these people, that makes you someone worth knowing. Cayla's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've spent 6 years believing my scars made me less than human. But these people, they see me as more because of them. Because you understand what they're going through, George said. You can offer them something no unmarked person ever could. Across the room, Cayla saw Lady Ashford, the woman who'd publicly declared her a discomfort best avoided. Their eyes met, and Cayla felt the familiar instinct to look away, to hide. Instead, she lifted her chin and held the woman's gaze. Lady Ashford looked away first. I want to do this more often, Cayla said, suddenly, turning to George. Not hide in my house or limit myself to hospital wards where no one from society will see me. I want to attend these functions, help organize them, use my experience for something meaningful. Then you should, George said simply.
people will talk. They already do." He offered his arm. "Shall we give them something more interesting to discuss?" Cayla took his arm, her scarred skin visible beside his pristine evening coat, and together they walked through the crowded room, not hiding, not apologizing, simply present. And for the first time in 6 years, Cayla felt like she belonged somewhere. The message reached George at his estate during breakfast. A brief note from Cayla's housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, written in shaking handwriting. "Miss Thompson has taken ill. The doctor has been called. She asked that you not be troubled, but I thought you should know." George left immediately. The journey to the Thompson residence took 40 minutes that felt like hours. His mind cataloged everything he knew about Cayla's recent schedule: 3 charity functions in 2 weeks, daily visits to the Veterans Hospital, late nights organizing a relief fund for factory fire victims. She'd been running herself into the ground, and he'd watched it happen without intervening because she'd seemed so alive, so purposeful. He should have said something. Mrs. Davies answered his frantic knock, her face drawn with worry. "Your Grace, thank goodness. The doctor's with her now. He says it's exhaustion and fever. She's been working herself sick for weeks, won't eat properly, barely sleeps." The elderly woman's voice cracked. "She's been asking for you, but she made me promise not to send word. Said she didn't want you to see her like this." "Where is she?" "Upstairs, but Your Grace, you wouldn't be proper." George was already moving toward the stairs. Propriety could hang itself. If Cayla thought he'd stay away because she was ill, she understood nothing about what had developed between them these past months. He found the doctor emerging from her room, a gray-haired man with tired eyes. "Your Grace," the physician said, clearly surprised. "I didn't realize Miss Thompson was expecting—" "How is she?" "Fever, severe exhaustion. Her body has simply given out from overwork. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and time to recover." The doctor's expression grew stern. "I've told her she must cease all charitable activities for at least a month. She's insisting she'll be back at the hospital by week's end. Perhaps you might convince her otherwise." George pushed past him into the room. Cayla lay in bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face flushed with fever. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Her scarred arm rested atop the coverlet, and even in illness, she hadn't thought to hide it. Her eyes opened when she heard him enter, and something like panic flashed across her face. "George, you shouldn't be here. Mrs. Davies wasn't supposed to send for you." "She didn't send for me. She informed me." He crossed to the bed, pulling a chair close. "There's a difference." "I look terrible. You look ill." He reached for her hand, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. "How long have you been feeling this way?" "A few days, maybe a week." She tried to pull her hand away but lacked the strength. "It's just exhaustion. I'll be fine." "You collapsed, Cayla." "I simply fainted. It's not—" "You've been working yourself to death." George's voice was sharper than he intended. 3 functions in 2 weeks, daily hospital visits, organizing relief funds until midnight? When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" She looked away. "There are people who need help, and you'll be no help to anyone if you kill yourself in the process." He gentled his tone, squeezing her hand. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling unwell?" "Because I didn't want you to see me like this." Her voice was barely audible. "Weak, dependent, everything I've tried not to be." "Cayla." George waited until she looked at him. "You showed me your scars during our first meeting. You cried in my arms. You've let me touch the parts of yourself you've spent 6 years hiding. Did you truly think being ill would somehow be worse than any of that? This is different." "How?" "Because the scars are permanent. They're part of who I am." Her fevered eyes glistened. "This is just weakness, failure. I should be stronger than this." George felt something crack in his chest. "You said I wasn't allowed to call myself inadequate. I'm extending the same courtesy to you. Being ill isn't weakness, it's biology. Your body is demanding the rest you've refused to give it. The hospital will manage without you for a few weeks." He released her hand, only to reach for the glass of water on her bedside table. "Here, the doctor says you need fluids." She took the glass with trembling hands, and George watched as she struggled to drink without spilling. When she'd managed a few sips, George took the glass back and set it aside. "I'm staying," he said quietly. "George, you can't. It's improper. People will—" "I'm staying," he repeated, more firmly this time. "You can argue if you like, but you're too ill to be particularly effective, and I'm too stubborn to listen anyway." A tear slid down her flushed cheek. "You said you weren't leaving that first night. I didn't believe you then either." "I know." He pulled the chair closer, settling in. "But I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere now." Cayla's eyes closed, exhaustion finally winning over pride. "You're impossibly stubborn. You've mentioned that before." George took Cayla's hand again, feeling her pulse flutter weakly beneath his fingers. "Sleep, Cayla. I'll be here when you wake." She fell asleep within minutes, her breathing labored, her hand still warm with fever in his. George stayed.
The fever worsened before it broke. George watched helplessly as Cayla thrashed in her sleep, murmuring incoherent fragments about fire and smoke and burning. Mrs. Davies brought cool water and clean cloths, showing him how to place them on Cayla's forehead and wrists to bring down the temperature. "You should rest, Your Grace," the housekeeper said on the second night. "I can sit with her." "No." George wrung out another cloth, his movements practiced now. "I'm staying." He'd sent word to his estate that he wouldn't be returning for several days. His steward would manage. His godmother would be scandalized. Society would have a field day with the scandal of a duke keeping vigil at an unmarried woman's bedside. None of it mattered. On the third night, when Cayla's fever spiked dangerously high, the doctor returned and pulled George aside. "Your Grace, if the fever doesn't break by morning, we may need to consider more aggressive treatment. Her condition is quite serious." George returned to his chair beside her bed, took her burning hand in his, and began to read aloud from a volume of poetry he'd found on her shelf. His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep, but he read anyway. Sonnets and odes and verses about gardens and seasons and the persistent nature of hope. Cayla's eyes fluttered open during a passage about spring returning after winter. "George?" Her voice was raw, confused. "Why are you reading poetry?" "Because you once told me you liked Wordsworth," he said, though he couldn't remember if she'd actually said that or if he'd simply invented it in his exhaustion. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses." She tried to sit up, but he pressed her gently back against the pillows. "How long have I been ill?" 3 days. Her eyes widened, focusing properly on him for the first time. He knew what she saw: his wrinkled shirt, unfastened collar, the stubble darkening his jaw, the deep shadows beneath his eyes. He looked nothing like a duke should look. "You've been here the entire time?" she whispered. "I told you I was staying." "But 3 days, George. You should have gone home. You need rest, proper food." "I have a chair, and Mrs. Davies has been extraordinarily accommodating with tea and sandwiches." He set the book aside, studying her face. The flush had faded slightly, and her eyes, while tired, were clearer than they'd been in days. "Your fever is breaking." "You stayed," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "Through all of it, even when I was delirious and probably said terrible things?" "You mostly talked about fire and your parents, and once demanded to know why the roses were burning." George managed a tired smile. "Nothing particularly terrible." Tears welled in her eyes. "I told you not to come. I said I didn't want you to see me like this." "Yes, well," he brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "I've never been particularly good at following instructions, especially not yours." "Why?" The question came out broken, desperate. "Why would you do this? Ruin your reputation? Exhaust yourself? Sit in this room for 3 days watching me be ill? We're not even formally courting. You owe me nothing." George was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully.
Then he said simply, "Because that first night you told me no gentleman had ever stayed once they saw your scars. You were testing whether I'd be any different. And I'm still here, Cayla." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar ridges of scar tissue. 3 months later, through garden walks and charity functions, and now 3 days of fever and delirium, I'm still here. She turned her face away, tears sliding down her temples into her hair. "I don't understand you." "I don't entirely understand myself," George admitted. "Only know that when I received word you were ill, the thought of you facing this alone was unbearable. So I came, and I stayed, and I'll continue staying for as long as you'll allow it. People will talk. Let them." He squeezed her hand gently. "I've spent my entire life worrying about what people think, trying to be adequate in everyone else's eyes. Do you know what I've discovered these past 3 months?" "What?" "That the only opinion that matters is yours, and you've never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am, inadequate title and all." Cayla laughed weakly, the sound catching on a sob. "You're not inadequate. You're just stubborn and impossibly kind, and apparently incapable of leaving when any sensible person would have run months ago. Then it's fortunate neither of us has ever been particularly sensible." George released her hand, only to pour fresh water. "Now, drink this. Doctor's orders." She obeyed, her movements still weak but steadier than before. When she finished, she lay back against the pillows and studied him with those disconcerting hazel eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying." "Always," George said, and realized he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with this particular illness and everything to do with the life he was beginning to imagine beyond it. Cayla's eyes drifted closed again, but this time her breathing was easier, her sleep natural rather than fevered. George settled back into his chair, the poetry book forgotten in his lap. He would stay as long as she needed him. He was beginning to suspect that might be forever.
Cayla's recovery was slow and frustratingly incomplete. A week after the fever broke, she could sit up without assistance, but still tired after minimal exertion. George visited daily, no longer bothering with propriety's pretense. They'd crossed that boundary during his vigil, and neither saw any point in retreating now. "You don't have to keep coming," Cayla said one afternoon as they sat in her drawing room. She'd insisted on leaving her bedroom, though the effort of dressing and descending the stairs had left her visibly exhausted. "I'm past the crisis. You've fulfilled any obligation you might have felt." George looked up from the book he'd been reading aloud. A novel this time, something with less melancholy than the poetry. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation?" "I don't know what else to call it." She twisted her hands in her lap. A gesture he'd learned meant she was afraid of the answer. "You're a duke, George. You could be anywhere, doing anything. Instead, you're here, reading novels to an invalid who can barely stay awake for more than an hour at a time." "I'm here because I want to be here." "But why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "What could you possibly gain from this? I'm not well enough to be entertaining company. I can't attend functions with you or help advance your social standing. I'm just—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "This, weak and useless and dependent." George closed the book and set it aside. "Do you remember what you told me when I called myself inadequate? That's different." "How?" He leaned forward. "You're doing exactly what I did, viewing yourself through society's eyes rather than your own, measuring your worth by what you can provide rather than who you are." "I'm not providing anything," Cayla said quietly. "I'm just here, being ill, being a burden. You're recovering from exhaustion brought on by working yourself to collapse, helping other people." George's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not weakness, Cayla. That's the consequence of caring too much and not knowing when to stop." She looked away, blinking back tears. "I'm afraid you're going to realize this isn't worth it, that I'm not worth it, and then you'll leave and I'll have to watch you go, knowing I was foolish enough to believe you might actually stay."
The honesty in her words struck him like a physical blow. "I have fears too," he said after a moment. "What could you possibly be afraid of?" "That I'll fail you." The admission came harder than he'd expected. "That eventually you'll need something from me, strength or certainty or whatever it is Dukes are supposed to provide, and I won't have it to give. That you'll see me clearly one day and realize you've attached yourself to a man who's fundamentally inadequate for the role he was born to fill." Cayla turned back to him, surprise evident in her expression. "You think I don't see you clearly?" "I think you see me more clearly than anyone ever has," George said, "which is precisely what terrifies me, because if you truly see me and still find me wanting—" He broke off, unable to finish the thought. "George!" Cayla reached across the small distance between them, her scarred hand finding his. "I've spent 6 years waiting for people to look at me and confirm that I'm damaged beyond repair. You've spent 11 years waiting for people to discover you're not the Duke they expect. We're both afraid of the same thing, being truly seen and found insufficient. And yet we keep looking at each other anyway," George said, his fingers closing around hers. "We do." She squeezed his hand. "Which is either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both." They sat in silence, hands joined, acknowledging the fear that lived in the space between them. George understood then that this, whatever this was becoming, wouldn't fix neither of them. Cayla's scars would remain. His inadequacy wouldn't miraculously transform into confidence. They were both damaged in ways that healing couldn't completely repair. But perhaps that was the point. "I can't promise I won't have days where I believe you're here out of obligation," Cayla said finally. 6 years of rejection doesn't disappear because one man decided to stay. "And I can't promise I won't have days where I'm convinced I'm failing you," George replied. 11 years of inadequacy doesn't vanish because one woman sees me differently." "So what do we do?" George considered the question seriously. "We try anyway. We acknowledge that we're both imperfect and frightened and possibly making a terrible mistake, and we choose to keep going despite that." "That's not very romantic." "No," he agreed, "but it's honest, and I think perhaps honesty matters more than romance at this stage." Cayla smiled a real smile, not the bitter or defensive ones he'd grown accustomed to. "Very well, Your Grace, we'll try, but I reserve the right to tell you when you're being foolish. And I reserve the right to ignore you and stay anyway. Stubborn man, stubborn woman." Her hand remained in his, scarred skin warm against his palm, and neither of them moved to break the contact. They weren't healed, they weren't even particularly confident in what they were doing, but they were here, together, and that felt like enough. For now, it was enough. The roses had been properly tended now. George had quietly arranged for a gardener to restore Cayla's neglected garden, and by late summer it bloomed with the kind of wild abundance that suggested nature working in partnership with careful human intervention, rather than against it. Cayla stood among the flowers, her sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the slight chill in the air. She'd stopped hiding months ago, first with George, then at charity functions, and finally in her daily life. The scars were simply part of her now, acknowledged but no longer weaponized. "I've been thinking," George said, approaching her along the newly repaired stone path. He'd arrived unannounced, as had become his habit. They'd long since abandoned the formality of scheduled visits. "That sounds dangerous," Cayla replied, not turning from the rosebush she was examining. "Should I be concerned?" "Possibly." He stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I've been thinking about the future, specifically, our future." Now she did turn, wariness flickering across her face. "George, let me finish before you start cataloging all the reasons this is a terrible idea." He took her scarred hand in his, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "We've known each other for 8 months. In that time, I've seen you at your worst. Ill, vulnerable, terrified. You've seen me at mine. Inadequate, exhausted, convinced I'm failing at everything a Duke should be. And yet, somehow, despite all of that, I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else in the world." "That's not very romantic. I'm aware." George squeezed her hand. "But it's true. I'm not asking because I've rescued you, or because society expects it, or because I need an heir. I'm asking because I choose you, scars and stubbornness and all, and I'd like to keep choosing you for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." Cayla's eyes glistened with tears. She didn't bother to hide. "I'm still damaged, George. Marriage won't change that." "I'm still inadequate. Marriage won't change that either." He brought her scarred hand to his lips, kissing the twisted flesh gently. "But perhaps we can be imperfect together. People will talk. They already do. Your family will object. Let them." His voice was steady now, certain. "I've spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations. I'm tired of it, Cayla. I want to live according to my own, and my expectation, my hope, is that you'll say yes." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt or obligation or pity. She found none of those things, only George, rumpled, earnest, impossibly stubborn George, who'd walked into her drawing room 8 months ago and refused to leave despite every reason she'd given him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that crossed his face was so profound it might have been comical if it weren't so genuine. "Truly?" "Don't make me repeat myself. It's unbecoming." But she was smiling now, tears spilling freely. "Yes, George, I choose you too." He pulled her close, and she went willingly, her scarred arms wrapping around him as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years instead of months. They stood among the roses, holding each other, and for the first time since the fire had stolen her parents and marked her forever, Cayla felt like she had found home. 3 months later, they attended the season's opening assembly as an engaged couple. Cayla wore a gown with short sleeves, her scars visible in the chandelier light. George stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her arm, covering some of the damaged tissue in a gesture that was both protective and proudly public. The whispers started immediately. Cayla heard fragments. Scarred, unsuitable. What could the Duke possibly see in her? But George's grip on her arm remained steady. "Still certain about this?" she murmured. "Entirely." He guided her toward the refreshment table, not avoiding the crowd, but moving through it deliberately. "You?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but yes." Lady Ashford approached, her expression a careful mask of politeness that didn't quite hide her disapproval. "Your Grace, Miss Thompson, how lovely to see you both." "Lady Ashford," George's tone was pleasant but contained a subtle warning. "Miss Thompson and I were just discussing the upcoming charity function for wounded veterans. I trust we can count on your attendance?" The older woman's mouth tightened. "I shall have to consult my calendar." "Do," Cayla spoke before she could stop herself. "We're hoping to raise funds for a new burn treatment facility. Your contribution would be most welcome." Lady Ashford's eyes flicked to Cayla's exposed scars, and for a moment the mask slipped into something like revulsion. Then she recovered, offered a brittle smile, and retreated into the crowd. "That was brave," George said quietly. "That was reckless," Cayla corrected, "but I find I'm tired of making myself smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort." "Good." He turned to face her fully, uncaring of the eyes still watching them. "Because I have no intention of making myself smaller either. We are exactly what we are, imperfect, stubborn, and bound to each other by choice rather than necessity. If society finds that unsuitable, that's their limitation, not ours." Cayla's eyes glistened with tears she didn't bother to hide. "I'm still damaged, George. Marriage won't change that." "I'm still inadequate. Marriage won't change that either." He brought her scarred hand to his lips, kissing the twisted flesh gently. "But perhaps we can be imperfect together." "People will talk. They already do." "Your family will object." "Let them." His voice was steady now, certain. "I've spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations. I'm tired of it, Cayla. I want to live according to my own. And my expectation, my hope, is that you'll say yes." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt or obligation or pity. She found none of those things. Only George, rumpled, earnest, impossibly stubborn George, who'd walked into her drawing room 8 months ago and refused to leave despite every reason she'd given him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that crossed his face was so profound it might have been comical if it weren't so genuine. "Truly? Don't make me repeat myself, it's unbecoming." But she was smiling now, tears spilling freely. "Yes, George, I choose you too." He pulled her close, and she went willingly, her scarred arms wrapping around him as naturally as if they had been doing this for years instead of months. They stood among the roses, holding each other, and for the first time since the fire had stolen her parents and marked her forever, Cayla felt like she had found home. 3 months later, they attended the season's opening assembly as an engaged couple. Cayla wore a gown with short sleeves, her scars visible in the chandelier light. George stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her arm, covering some of the damaged tissue in a gesture that was both protective and proudly public. The whispers started immediately. Cayla heard fragments. Scarred, unsuitable. What could the Duke possibly see in her? But George's grip on her arm remained steady. "Still certain about this?" she murmured. "Entirely." He guided her toward the refreshment table, not avoiding the crowd, but moving through it deliberately. "You?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but yes." Lady Ashford approached, her expression a careful mask of politeness that didn't quite hide her disapproval. "Your Grace, Miss Thompson, how lovely to see you both." "Lady Ashford," George's tone was pleasant but contained a subtle warning. "Miss Thompson and I were just discussing the upcoming charity function for wounded veterans. I trust we can count on your attendance?" The older woman's mouth tightened. "I shall have to consult my calendar." "Do," Cayla spoke before she could stop herself. "We're hoping to raise funds for a new burn treatment facility. Your contribution would be most welcome." Lady Ashford's eyes flicked to Cayla's exposed scars, and for a moment the mask slipped into something like revulsion. Then she recovered, offered a brittle smile, and retreated into the crowd. "That was brave," George said quietly. "That was reckless," Cayla corrected. "But I find I'm tired of making myself smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort." "Good." He turned to face her fully, uncaring of the eyes still watching them. "Because I have no intention of making myself smaller either. We are exactly what we are, imperfect, stubborn, and bound to each other by choice rather than necessity. If society finds that unsuitable, that's their limitation, not ours." Cayla's eyes glistened with tears she didn't bother to hide. "I'm still damaged, George. Marriage won't change that. I'm still inadequate. Marriage won't change that either." He brought her scarred hand to his lips, kissing the twisted flesh gently. "But perhaps we can be imperfect together. People will talk. They already do. Your family will object. Let them." His voice was steady now, certain. "I've spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations. I'm tired of it, Cayla. I want to live according to my own." "And my expectation, my hope, is that you'll say yes." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt or obligation or pity. She found none of those things. Only George, rumpled, earnest, impossibly stubborn George, who'd walked into her drawing room 8 months ago and refused to leave despite every reason she'd given him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that crossed his face was so profound it might have been comical if it weren't so genuine. "Truly? Don't make me repeat myself, it's unbecoming." But she was smiling now, tears spilling freely. "Yes, George, I choose you too." He pulled her close, and she went willingly, her scarred arms wrapping around him as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years instead of months. They stood among the roses, holding each other, and for the first time since the fire had stolen her parents and marked her forever, Cayla felt like she'd found home. 3 months later, they attended the season's opening assembly as an engaged couple. Cayla wore a gown with short sleeves, her scars visible in the chandelier light. George stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her arm, covering some of the damaged tissue in a gesture that was both protective and proudly public. The whispers started immediately. Cayla heard fragments. Scarred, unsuitable. What could the Duke possibly see in her? But George's grip on her arm remained steady. "Still certain about this?" she murmured. "Entirely." He guided her toward the refreshment table, not avoiding the crowd, but moving through it deliberately. "You?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But yes." Lady Ashford approached, her expression a careful mask of politeness that didn't quite hide her disapproval. "Your Grace, Miss Thompson, how lovely to see you both." "Lady Ashford." George's tone was pleasant, but contained a subtle warning. "Miss Thompson and I were just discussing the upcoming charity function for wounded veterans. I trust we can count on your attendance?" The older woman's mouth tightened. "I shall have to consult my calendar." "Do," Cayla spoke before she could stop herself. "We're hoping to raise funds for a new burn treatment facility. Your contribution would be most welcome." Lady Ashford's eyes flicked to Cayla's exposed scars, and for a moment the mask slipped into something like revulsion. Then she recovered, offered a brittle smile, and retreated into the crowd. "That was brave," George said quietly. "That was reckless," Cayla corrected, "but I find I'm tired of making myself smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort." "Good." He turned to face her fully, uncaring of the eyes still watching them. "Because I have no intention of making myself smaller either. We are exactly what we are, imperfect, stubborn, and bound to each other by choice rather than necessity. If society finds that unsuitable, that's their limitation, not ours." Cayla looked around the ballroom at the curious faces, the whispered conversations, the judgment that would follow them for years to come. She felt George's hand warm on her scarred arm, saw the certainty in his eyes, and realized something profound. Being seen, truly, completely seen, scars and all, was worth every risk. "Dance with me," she said suddenly. "Here? Now?" "Here. Now." She offered him her scarred hand. "Let them see, George. Let them see exactly what they're judging." He took her hand and led her onto the floor. As they moved through the waltz, Cayla felt the weight of watching eyes, heard the increased volume of whispers. But she also felt George's steady presence, saw the quiet pride in his expression, and understood that this choice to be present, to be visible, to refuse erasure, was its own kind of courage. They weren't healed, they weren't perfect, but they were here, together, choosing each other again and again despite every reason the world gave them not to. And that, Cayla thought as George spun her through the turn, was enough. It would always be enough.